And as I sort of take this look across time at the global, you can start to sort of see where we are relative to some of the influences upon us in the past through now, and what seems to be, in a sense, continuing. And so, taking it then a now perspective and from a historical perspective, I think of Australia, and you know, perhaps you know this, but Australia is the home of the longest civilization in the world, the Australian Aboriginal population, which dates back, I think estimates around 50,000 years. When Australia was first colonised, which was in the late 1700s, the population of the Australian Aboriginal group was around 700,000. This is going. By the time I was born, with the attitude to the Aborigines and in a sense, almost genocide that occurred, and certainly assimilation, the population was down to about 100,000 Aboriginals. From 700,000 when we first arrived. The British did a fairly tricky sort of international move. When they came to Australia, they declared it terra nullius, a country without civilization, without culture. Indeed, the Australian Aborigines had a wonderful relationship to land and country. They didn't till the land, they didn't farm it, but they had a natural relation, a very healthy diet. They had a very healthy existence with fairly good longevity. But they declared terra nullius as an excuse to sort of say, well, nobody lives here, so we have a right to take it over. So they arrived in 1788. About the time I was born, which is post-World War II, our population was around 8 mil. Probably between 6 and 8 million. And I remember it being declared a big moment when we got to 8 mil. And we were predominantly British, Irish, Scottish, with a few other primarily Europeans. We were, you know, I think back then a fairly monoculturally oriented group of people who were quite, I think, sort of racist. Now the Australian Aboriginal population, by the way, is up to about 400,000. About 2% of our population, except for younger people, at about 4%. It wasn't until the 1960s that they got the right to vote, and our overall population is around 22 mil. And what's interesting in that overall population in terms of migrants, people who migrated there today, you probably got an equal number of around 2 mil of European descent, and who were born in Europe, and about 2 mil who were born in Asia. It's a very different country. It's much more multicultural and multilingual. When I was growing up, we had clubs with rules that you could only speak English there. And so, so you've got a sort of a shift, I think, occurring from what I would consider to be a fairly monocultural people, very steeped in I think, British traditions, to a group right now which is similar to some of the other great cities like Vancouver, where it's hard to identify a majority group. The group is so diverse, and in Australia now there's a lot more emphasis upon respecting people's heritage languages, and I would estimate in Sydney there are probably around about 150 different languages spoken by different groups. It's interesting, I go back to when I was growing up, which was the 50s and 60s. It was the time of the Vietnam War. And it was there was a sort of a fear of Asia. Australia was like a European country in the antipodes here, with a close neighbour, New Zealand. And one of our most important treaties was the treaty with New Zealand and the US. The US has basically saved our butt in World War II. what's interesting, a friend of mine did this map, and he missed out on Britain over here. That could have been that could have been an unconscious relay by myself, because Britain became unpopular with Australia during World War II because they wanted to keep Australian troops in Europe to defend Britain, but not allow Australian troops to come home to defend Australia. And likewise, in a sense, the monarchy sometimes still holds it over us, particularly, I think, one of the other things which was, I think, quite tragic was in the 70s when the Governor-General dismissed Gough Whitlam's parliament. But our connections as a result of World War II became much more biased towards to the US, but it was still very much tied up with the Vietnam psychology of the domino theory, where people were afraid that what we were going to see coming down through Russia, China, into Indonesia was communism. Those sort of notions were sort of perpetuated in I think the 60s and early 70s. Now the connections are quite different. Indeed, I would sort of say that Australia clearly identifies itself as in the Asia Pacific, and to a large extent has stopped looking to England for its identity. Like most of the other world, we're very influenced in terms of our popular culture by the US. But you can start to sort of see some of the global developments that are relevant to looking at the global issues. In one sense, I think Australia believes, as its trade has sort of flowed, the axis of the world has sort of shifted from Europe at one point to the US, and now it's through the Asia Pacific. We have three of the largest populations, China, India, and Indonesia. And Australia is constantly working on building strong ties and relationships with countries which, when I was growing up, they tended to view as almost as some group to be feared. But they're building relationships with particularly those three countries, Indonesia, China, India, but also the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, and Singapore. And nowadays Vietnam. So it's a very, very different sort of time globally. You still have the remnants, however, of this then, and it's not a clear wall between the sort of heavy British influence and this shift towards this Asian Pacific influence. What I'd like to do now is sort of look at these same sort of trends, but look at it specifically in terms of what this meant relative to educational matters. And so let me move next to looking at education then and now, and pick up on a few more issues that pertain to the global trends that we will see and be talking about across the lecture.